about COVID, unfortunately, so we had to rearrange some things, and we're back on. And joining us right now on the show, his name is Stephen Kirsch. He is an American entrepreneur. Because of my interview with Dr. Peter McCullough, I've had the opportunity to talk with him, and I'm grateful for that. Started up several companies, and been both a philanthropic supporter of medical research, and he studied COVID-19 and the COVID vaccines. Stephen, I'm sorry to keep you waiting, my friend. I appreciate you being here. How are you?
I'm good. No problem.
Appreciate you being here, Stephen. All right. So let me start out by asking you this. There's some people that have done a lot of studies, COVID research, vaccines, but they always have a reason for why they're doing it. And sometimes that reason is not to help people. You're very different than some of the other people I've talked to in that you didn't do this to make money. You know what I'm saying? Some other people do it. They want to sell their books. They want to make their appearances on TV and make speeches. You're not one of those people, right? You're somebody that has done very well for himself financially, and you're not doing it for those reasons. Why have you decided to do this?
Save lives. It's the same reason that Bobby Kennedy changed over from doing environmental work, and he switched to vaccines. Once you see the evidence, it's very compelling. And I asked Bobby whether he ever regretted his decision to switch careers, and he said, "I didn't have a choice." And I feel the same way. That once you see this, and once you see what's happening to people and the injuries being caused by the vaccines, then you realize that anything that you did that was not related to this would be much less meaningful in comparison. So I had the financial resources to be able to essentially quit my job and work for free, and the benefit is I help people.
Okay, so that's admirable. Let's talk about that. As you know, billions of people have been vaccinated. Billions, more than half the world. As you also know, every vaccine is going to have its risks. Every vaccine are going to have quote unquote injuries from that. There's no vaccine that's perfect. There's no vaccine that's 100% foolproof. But if more than half the world has taken the vaccine, why do you think the vaccines are so dangerous?
Well, we could start off, first of all, by asking the question, is there a benefit? And I'm not trying to avoid your question, but first we have to establish whether there's a benefit for the vaccines, because as you know, all vaccines have risks. The reason they have liability protection is because the manufacturers said we can't make a safe vaccine. And so it's acknowledged by the manufacturers that the vaccines are inherently unsafe. And so the question is whether there's a benefit that's going to outweigh the risk. And the data actually shows the reverse. The data shows that there's no hospitalization benefit. And the data also shows that you're more likely to be infected with COVID if you get the shots. Now,
what data are you referring to?
I'm referring to there were two studies that were done by the Cleveland Clinic that were published in the peer-reviewed medical journals. And those studies showed that the people who got more shots were more likely to be infected. And in fact, it was very, very clear, and the confidence intervals did not overlap, which means essentially it's statistically significant that the more shots you got, the more likely you were to be infected. Now, you could say, well, maybe that study was flawed for some reason, but I was able to replicate that with a FOIA request to my own Santa Clara County Department of Public Health. And that FOIA request looked at people who were diagnosed with COVID in January of 2022, at a time when 75% of the Santa Clara population was vaccinated with COVID. And they found that 98% of the people who were infected with COVID, they were vaccinated. And so effectively what that means is that the people who got vaccines were more likely to get COVID rather than less likely.
Were they more likely to get sick and die?
We don't know what the Santa Clara County Health Department stats were just on infections.
Okay, so let me ask you this then, because it's an important question, Stephen. If in fact it's true that if you got vaccinated, you were less likely to go to the ICU and less likely to die, wouldn't you be okay with people getting vaccinated if that was the case?
I might be if I had data that showed me that, but the data that was been published in the peer-reviewed medical journals in JAMA, which is one of the top journals for medical information, April 6th of 2023, there was a research letter published by a very senior epidemiologist in the VA, and they compared the people who are hospitalized for COVID versus people who are hospitalized for influenza. And this is a very well done study, and they showed that the populations had very similar makeup between people who were hospitalized for COVID versus the flu. And what they looked at whether you had a single COVID vaccine, two COVID vaccines, a booster, and they also looked at whether you were vaccinated for the flu. And they did the breakdowns in both columns. If you were hospitalized for COVID, they did the breakdown. And if you were hospitalized for the flu, they did the breakdown. And the numbers were identical in both columns. And so that shows you that there's no hospitalization benefit for the COVID vaccine, and there's no hospitalization benefit for the flu vaccine. Because if the vaccines work, there'd be a differential.
How many people were in this study?
Thousands. Thousands of people. Yes.
Okay.
10,000. Statistically significant, Brian. So, I looked at the numbers and we look at statistical confidence intervals for that. And there's no doubt that the vaccines are basically not working. I mean, the numbers were almost identical. I mean, you couldn't, these are raw numbers and they're virtually identical in every single category. In fact, the closest category, Brian, then this is quite stunning. The closest category where the numbers were within 1% of each other was in the COVID boosted case. In other words, the vaccine of all of the dose 1, dose 2, dose 3, dose 4, whatever, the vaccine that's least likely to work is the one that was given most recently. Mm-hmm. It's precisely the opposite. And I contacted the author of that paper, Brian, and I asked him, I said, look, am I misinterpreting this? This is what it appears to show. It appears to show that you accidentally showed that the COVID vaccines and the flu vaccines don't work. And he said, well, I can't explain it, and I don't really have time to look at that issue.
Okay, so he's not saying that that's the case, though. He's the one who did the study, and he wasn't willing to admit it. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, of course he's not. But he cannot explain it, Brian. That's the thing.
So if
the guy who wrote the study cannot explain why those two columns were identical.
So if he can't explain it, then why can you?
Oh, he knows the answer. He knows it's because he admits that the prima facie evidence is that though it is very convincing evidence that the vaccine doesn't work.
But don't you think we need more than one study to make that assessment? That because you're making the case that the vaccines don't work, they don't give you any positives, that they don't do anything. That's basically what you're stating. And you have this one epidemiologist that says he can't explain it, that did this one study that I haven't read yet, which I'm glad to read. And then you have the Cleveland Clinic that you claim had two studies that say the same. What about the hundreds and hundreds of other studies throughout the country that say the opposite, which I have read? Is everybody else wrong and these several studies are right?
Well, they can't both be right, Brian. And
I agree.
So you can look at these studies and you can look at each one and then try to explain it. And, this is just so devastating, right? Because there are lots of studies that can show effects, but the problem is that the studies are done with the assumption that people, there are, for example, mortality studies. And there was just a study that was done in the UK by Professor Norman Fenton. And when you read that, it shows the numbers from Czechoslovakia, and the numbers showed that in Czechoslovakia, the amount of COVID deaths were very small, like 0.3%. And so they could see a differential in people who were vaccinated versus unvaccinated in terms of all-cause mortality. Now, the COVID vaccines do not protect you from dying in car accidents and from cancer and so forth. They're specifically designed for one thing, which is COVID. And if there are no COVID deaths, there shouldn't be a discrepancy in the mortality from the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. But they found that there was a huge mortality difference in these people who are dying who are not dying from COVID. So there is a confounding factor that people are not taking into account. And so the beauty of this study from the VA is that the differential between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, you didn't have to worry about it because you were just looking at the percentage of people hospitalized for COVID versus the flu. So this is a much more objective way to look at the data that is much more convincing because it eliminates the confounders that we know exist.
Well,
and so when you do a good study, you get a result, and that's the result. The result is believable because there's no way that this thing could be confounded. It's the same population. It has the same baseline characteristics, and some people just got the flu randomly, and people got COVID randomly. So it's almost like a real life randomized trial.
I understand
and the results were stunning.
But for every study like this that you would say is stunning, you could name 100 studies that were peer reviewed that would go by what I would say, which is, and this is my opinion, I'm not a doctor, you're not a doctor, but that the vaccines are overwhelmingly safe and that the vaccines did more good for harm. Let's talk about me personally here, and then you can give me your thoughts on it. I am a juvenile diabetic, which means my immune system is probably not as good as yours or the average American in this country. I got COVID before the vaccines were out. I almost died. I was in the ICU for 2 weeks. They almost put me on a ventilator. I was very lucky to survive. Then the vaccines came out several months later. I got vaccinated. I didn't have any antibodies in me. How do I know that? Because I was tested for antibodies. And then a few weeks after that, I got COVID. And then I got COVID again. And then I got COVID again. I got COVID 3 times after being vaccinated. And every single time I got COVID, it was like the sniffles. I was over it in a day. When I wasn't vaccinated, I almost died. So am I just the luckiest person in the world with a bad immune system? Or would one reasonable person say, like my personal physicians and infectious disease doctors that I've told my medical history to, that the vaccines most likely saved my life?
Well, it's hard to extrapolate from individual stories like yours because your story can be easily explained by, well, you survived COVID. Now you have natural immunity. You essentially got vaccinated because you got COVID. So the vaccine didn't add anything because your immune system was already primed for the next time you got the virus.
That's not what I was told, but that's not what I was told, Stephen. I checked to see if I had antibodies and I was not immune to COVID, I was told.
Yeah. Well, antibodies are not the only way that your body fights off infection, Brian. So I'm not talking about you were told what you were told. I'm just saying that there is a very rational explanation for what happened to you. And you see, if you don't have antibodies when you got the natural virus, then you're unlikely to get antibodies if you get the vaccine as well, because the reason the vaccine works is because it leverages your immune system. So if your immune system didn't work against the real thing, it's going to work less well against the vaccine.
Then how can you explain my personal situation where I get COVID for the first time and almost die, one of the more serious cases, and then after being vaccinated and boosted, I get COVID 3 times and I'm over it in a day, and it was not even as bad as a common cold? How can that be explained?
I just explained it to you, Brian, but I'll explain it to you again. The explanation is you got COVID and you recovered. Your getting COVID is essentially like getting a super vaccine. It's the most powerful vaccine for any virus is getting the virus itself. We don't have a vaccine that is better than getting the real thing. So you got the real thing and you survived. So now you're inoculated, but you were inoculated by getting COVID. You were not inoculated by getting the vaccine. And the viruses that have happened since you got COVID have been less debilitating. People, it's not just you, Brian, it's other people who are unvaccinated who get COVID who have a much milder case now because the variants are less.
In some cases, but there are also cases where people got COVID a second and third time and died as well. So it could go both.
Of course.
It could go both ways, as you know.
And most of the people, by the way, most of the people who die from COVID die in the hospital, and most of the people who die in COVID from the hospital die from the treatment protocols rather than from the disease itself. And we know that because Paul Merrick had a protocol for treating people in the ICU. So these are the sickest people with COVID. And he had nearly 100% success ratio in curing people with COVID in the ICU. So he was taking the toughest cases and he was getting a 97% success ratio. And he was called in by his hospital administrator and he was told that he couldn't use his protocol anymore and that he had to use the CDC protocol. So he followed instructions, went to the CDC protocol, and 100% of his patients died after that. 7 patients in a row, including people who are very young.
So we talked about this.
Hang on. Yeah.
Well, go ahead. I just want to say
we talked about it on the phone, but we haven't talked about it with your listeners. And so he went to his management and he said, this isn't working. The CDC protocol is much less. I've had 7 patients in a row die. This is ridiculous. I want to go back to my own treatment protocol, which was saving 97% of the people instead of losing 100%. And he was told that he had to follow the CDC protocol. So he quit. He's a man of ethics, and I really admire him for that. Dr. Paul Merrick.
My question to that story, which I told you off the air, where is this guy? Where is that paperwork? What are the medications that he gave his patients? Where is the evidence? Now, I'd like to put everybody on the honor system, but I'm just not going to do that when we're talking about vaccines and medicine and saving people's lives. If this guy claims he lost his job because of it, and he claimed he had medicines that were curing people of COVID, then I want to see the actual evidence, not just somebody that claims it. Where is the actual paperwork and evidence? Where are the patients that he claimed he saved their lives? What exactly did he give them? And I don't see any of that information online. I don't see any of that information that he put forth. Why is that if it's true?
I don't know. Why don't you have, I was just talking to him earlier today. I have his number. How about you give him a call and have him on your show and have him answer that?
I don't have a problem with doing that, but I would ask him the same question. Just because he says something on the radio doesn't mean it actually happened. There are some doctors out there, and I'm not saying you're not a doctor. And what makes you unique, Steve, and I mean that as a compliment compared to some other people that I've interviewed, is you're not trying to make money off this. Like you said, you're trying to save people's lives. And I think your heart is certainly coming from the right place. I can't say that about some other people. There are ulterior motives. And I'm not saying Big Pharma doesn't have ulterior motives as well. They do. Okay. I'm with you on that. But when somebody makes a claim like that, that is a very serious one, claiming they lost their job because they were saving people's lives, because I don't entirely believe that. And they make a claim that this one doctor was curing people of COVID way before anybody else was. I have a lot of questions when it comes to that. So I'm happy to have him on the show, but I want to know where his actual evidence is, not what he claims he did. Does that make sense?
You can talk to him about the individual cases. The individual cases are in the hospital. And of course, the system makes the extraction of hospital records of his patients impossible.
Sure.
So how do you expect him, Brian? How do you expect him to prove what he saw?
You can prove it if he was in fear that the hospitals would delete all of the evidence, which is another very serious claim. But if
he's not claiming that, Brian. He's only claiming that he can't get access to the records. Once the records belong to the hospital, he's not allowed to take them home and write up a paper on this. He has to be able to access those records. The hospital's not going to give him access to the records.
No, but he could have made copies.
They just fired him.
Yeah, he could have made copies of the records. I just
no. But Brian, come on, he's an honest guy. He's not allowed to do that.
I mean, listen. Again, I understand what you're saying. And I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. But if a random doctor that I've never heard of before claims that he saved a bunch of lives by giving them medication, which you haven't named which medication. I don't even know what he gave these patients. But you're claiming that he gave them medications that every other doctor did not give their patients. And it saved their lives. 100%, it saved all their lives.
No, I said 97%, Brian.
So almost 100%. I got you. So 90, which is an unbelievable figure. That I think it's important to show some evidence and not just go on the honor system. That's all I'm trying to say. I know that when I was in the hospital, they gave me remdesivir, which you've said is a dangerous drug. I believe it saved my life. They gave me antibodies, they gave me steroids, and it cleared up my lungs. I'm all in favor, doctor, of medications that work, just like you are. I'm all in favor of medications. And if the CDC, or if there's evidence that anybody for that matter is withholding drugs that could save people's lives, I have a serious problem with that. I just want evidence. I want what you want. I want people to be safe. I want people to be healthy. And I want people to take medications with confidence that it has a very low side effect or low chance of you seriously getting ill or dying. I'm with you on that 100%.
Great, great. Then you should have him on your show, Brian.
I'll have him on, but I'm going to ask him where the evidence is.
Fine. Paul Merrick is one of the he's the top intensivist, the number one published intensivist in the world. He's published more papers on intensive care medicine than anybody in the world. So if there's somebody who's credible, who should be believed, I mean, like, what do you think his motivation for lying about this would be? He basically lost his job. He lost his income. Yeah. He didn't have something to jump to. Like, why would he do this?
Why would 90% of all infectious disease experts, 90% of all doctors and physicians claim that for the most part, the vaccines are very safe? Why would they all lie? I would ask you the same question. Why would Dr. Fauci lie?
Because they're believing the fraudulent data from the clinical trials that were done. Now, the Pfizer trials, Brian, if you actually look at the FDA record, the Pfizer trials, there were 311 people excluded from the treatment arm in the Pfizer trials. This is filed with the FDA. Anyone can verify this. And there were 61 that were ejected from the trial for protocol violations for the same thing in the placebo group. Now, Brian, that's a factor of 5 difference between the two. And 311 versus 61, if you do the math and you do a Fisher exact test on the chance of that happening, it's basically statistically impossible. And nobody's asking the questions like, why were 311 people ejected in this arm versus 61? It doesn't make any sense. The only thing that does make sense is that the people who were ejected from the treatment arm had a reaction to the treatment, and they were ejected because they couldn't get the second dose and they weren't counted. And so it made it look like both arms had equal safety records, when it was very obvious for anybody who looked at that data that was filed with the FDA before the drug was approved by the FDA. It's very obvious that the vaccine was not safe, because if the vaccine was safe, you'd have equal numbers being ejected from the trial, and there weren't.
Well,
nobody can explain that, Brian.
Well, here's the thing.
Nobody can explain that.
So you've said
you can't explain it.
Well, I mean, here's what I will say.
And that's gold standard. That is gold standard information. The clinical trials are known as gold standard because they're supposed to be randomized, double blind. Okay, in the gold standard trials, you have this 5-to-1 discrepancy between people being ejected from the trial, and nobody is even talking about that. There's no article in the New York Times. Nobody's talking about this. Like, the only time people are hearing about this is on your show.
Yeah. Well, here's I'm going to speak in general terms here, very general terms. Billions of people have been vaccinated. You've made the claim that you believe 1 in 1,000 people have died in direct evidence from taking the vaccine. If that was true in this country, that would be the leading cause of death in this country. Last I checked, it's nowhere near the leading cause of death in this country. 1 in 1,000 it would be extremely dangerous. And to make
that's not true. Well, why do you say it's the leading cause of death? Do you know
if it was 1 in 1,000? If it was 1 in 1,000 people dying of the vaccine, it'd be one of the leading causes of death in this country.
It wouldn't. No, it wouldn't, Brian, because you need to do the math. Do you understand? Do you even know what the death rate is in America? You know how many people die in America per year?
I don't have those exact numbers in front of me. Of course not.
Okay. Well, then you're making the claim.
How many people live in this country? How many people live in this country?
There are somewhere around 350 million people, 370 million people.
If you're claiming 1 in 1,000 people die of the vaccination, how many people were vaccinated? And that would mean how many people have died?
275 million people.
Okay. And 1 in 1,000 What does the math tell you? That would tell you hundreds of thousands
Oh,
of people.
sure. I mean, if you just do it on a per person vaccinated, 1 in 1,000
Right.
is 275,000 people.
Right. And you've made the
That's
claim that
nothing.
well, I don't think that's nothing. I think that's quite a lot of people. And you've made the
Well,
claim that
it is. I mean, but the point is that things like there are other things that kill people to a higher extent. So this may be at 275,000 people versus the 3 million people who die is on the order of 10% of the people. Well, cancer and heart disease and so forth kill higher percentages than that. So
right, but a
when
lot
you
of those
say it's
people, I agree with you, but a lot of those people that are dying of heart disease are dying from a heart attack since they were vaccinated. All I'm simply saying is people like you make the claim that they must have died from the vaccination because they died of heart disease several months after getting vaccinated. And in my personal opinion, with all due respect, I find that to be very dangerous to make claims like that without having the evidence to back it up.
so again, you made the claim that if it was 1 in 1,000 people who
One
died
of the
from the
leading causes
vaccine,
of death.
no,
Absolutely.
no, 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 you said it would be the leading cause of death, and it's not
And
true.
I misspoke. One of the leading
Okay.
causes of death.
Okay,
One
well,
of the leading causes of
that's
death.
why I corrected you.
Sure.
I said,
Sure.
yeah, okay, it would be one of the leading causes of death. And
So
people are looking the other way. Brian, how many autopsies in the United States have been done where they did the proper assays in order to determine whether the vaccine caused the death? How many deaths do you know where they actually even looked to do a test to find out whether the death was caused by the vaccine?
And my question led with a question. If they haven't done the proper necessities in an autopsy, then how can you make a gross assumption that they died from the vaccine? If you're making the case, Steve, that they haven't done enough due diligence to check and see if the person who died from a vaccine, how can you make the correlation? Well, they must have died from the vaccine because they didn't do enough research after that person died.
Because there are people who did do the research,
Okay.
except it's not in the United States of America. And so they looked at bodies that people who died within, I think it was 20 days of taking a vaccine to find out whether the vaccine might have killed them. And they looked at people who died, and they look at people who died, and they got the bodies within 20 days of death, and then they tried to ascertain the cause of death. They look at 35 bodies, and they discovered that 5 had significant evidence of the vaccine.
Steve, I have to stop
vaccine causing the death.
They don't have
this is the Schwab study.
I understand.
Have you read the study? Have you read the study,
No.
Brian?
No, I did not, but I'm just going by
You
what
haven't
you
read the
just
study.
said.
Okay.
No, I
I'm
haven't.
sure
But
Peter
hold on.
Schirmacher was a co-author.
on.
See, Peter Schirmacher was the senior author on that. Peter Schirmacher is one of the
I don't care who is the senior on it. I don't care.
He's
It
one of the
doesn't
most
matter.
respected pathologists in the world.
But
Brian.
Steve, listen to what I'm just going by what you said in this interview. You're making an assumption in the United States of America that 1 in 1,000 people die from getting vaccinated. You've openly admitted that they haven't done enough research on the dead bodies, or they haven't done the autopsies properly to find out whether they died from the vaccine or not. And then you state a study in another country where they only looked at 35 bodies. Let me repeat. Billions of people are vaccinated in this country. They did a study of 35 bodies. And of those 35, I would assume random people who died after being vaccinated, they found 5. And you're turning that into 5 out of 35 in a random study in another country. So let's assume that 500,000 people have died of the vaccinations in this country. Steve, with all due respect, that's ridiculous.
Brian, it's not based on that. You asked me what proof I had for the vaccine killing people. And that's the most direct proof was that particular study. But it's not the only study, Brian.
I hope not.
It's not the only data point. The other data points show similar numbers.
With 35 bodies or 30 bodies?
No, with millions and millions of people.
So millions of people were done a proper toxicology report, death. They did a proper study after they had already died. So they did it properly, millions of people?
Millions of people, yeah.
Autopsies that have done that
No,
prove.
no, there were no autopsies. Brian, I told you that there are only a handful of people who have ever had a COVID autopsy to
So
determine
with that being
direct
okay, I'm with you.
evidence.
I
Okay. So
understand.
you have to look at the indirect evidence because people are basically looking the other way. They don't want to know. Brian, if people wanted to show that the vaccines do not kill people, why isn't the CDC telling everybody to do, when you do the autopsy, to do the test and let's gather the data
Because
and let's know for sure?
because there are laws in this country where if an autopsy is done, in a lot of cases, it's up to the family whether they want an autopsy done. It's not your business how somebody died. It's the family, and this is personal medical history. That's why. And the only thing you've given me with direct evidence, and I'll look at that study, by the way, Steve, is 35 dead bodies that were vaccinated, and they found in 5 of those bodies, I'm just assuming this from what you're telling me, I haven't looked at the study, that 5 of those 35 deaths were linked to the vaccine, and somehow we're correlating that to 500,000 people have died from the vaccine in this country, and I find that to be a conspiracy theory.
It's no, like I said, Brian, there are lots of studies that
Give me
show
one in
the
this
link.
country. Give me one in this country with direct link. That had a bunch of dead bodies. They did the autopsy, proven on the death certificate that American died of the vaccine. Give me one study that you can cite.
There isn't one published in the peer-reviewed literature because there's only one guy in America who's actually, that I know of, that's even doing the pathology to find the link.
I'm
Why
okay
is
with
it that? So Brian, are you okay with, well, like it doesn't cost that much in dollars and time to do the studies? Why do you think nobody has done a study to prove the vaccines aren't killing people? In fact, the best study that we have in the United States was a poll that was done of embalmers, and they polled the embalmers and they said, "Have you ever seen these white fibrous clots in your cases?" And the answer was, in 50% of the embalmers are seeing these white fibrous clots, and some of them are seeing in 90% of the cases. And there are a large number of these embalmers.
You want to listen to embalmers and what they
No,
have to say?
I don't. No, I don't want to listen.
You don't want to listen to all the infectious disease experts in this country, Dr.
No,
Birch.
I want to listen to the data. Brian,
But you don't
want to listen to the data.
But you don't have any direct evidence or data
because they're not collecting the data, Brian.
So because they're not collecting the data the way you would like, you're making an assumption that all these people are dying of the vaccines.
No,
Steve, you're smarter than that.
No, it's not the way did I ever say they're not collecting it the way I like? I'm just saying that they've not run.
You're making
Let me tell you what my claim was. Don't interrupt, okay? My claim was that they're not doing the proper assays to investigate the link. Now, they can make an assessment. They don't have to follow my procedure. I don't have a procedure. They can follow Brian Ryan Cole's, Dr. Ryan Cole's protocol for seeing whether they have the COVID, whether they were killed by the COVID vaccine, and he can differentiate.
Can you tell me who that is?
He's a pathologist.
Is he an infectious disease expert or
no? He's a pathologist.
Okay, so he's a random pathologist that doesn't like the way they're testing or doing autopsies.
He has very impressive credentials. Okay. But the point is, Brian.
So does Dr. Fauci. Would you say Dr. Fauci has impressive credentials?
Yes, Fauci has impressive credentials.
Why is it that so many people on the right go after him and claim that he was part of conspiracy theories that created COVID? If he's got impressive credentials and Dr. Birx has impressive credentials, why do so many people on the far right go after these people who do have impressive credentials? I agree with you. And go after Dr. Fauci and say he belongs in jail. I mean, Dr. Peter McCullough came on this show and I found it insulting that he was trying to make the case that Dr. Fauci belongs in jail, that somehow part of depopulation, that Dr. Fauci wanted this to happen. And you would say that Dr. Peter McCullough has impressive credentials. He's making a ridiculous conspiracy theorist claim, like so many do on InfoWars. I know you know people over there at InfoWars that make absurd claims. You would say that a guy that has impressive credentials like Dr. McCullough going after Dr. Fauci saying he belongs in jail. Don't you think that hurts the credibility of somebody like that when they make a claim like that? I'm not saying you said it, Steve, but Peter McCullough is and other doctors are.
I don't think it ever hurts his credibility to tell the truth.
So you think Dr. Fauci is telling it, or you think Peter McCullough is telling the truth when he says that Dr. Fauci is a part of depopulation in the United States of America, meaning he wanted millions and millions of people to die. Somehow Dr. Fauci wanted depopulation. Why did he want depopulation? Where's the evidence?
I listened to your interview of him, and I think you're misquoting and misinterpreting him. So maybe if you want to go and get the clip, we can talk about it.
He claims that Dr. Fauci intentionally created COVID. He intentionally created COVID. Now, only thing I can think of is if you think that Dr. Fauci intentionally created this very dangerous virus, I with no evidence, by the way, people can say what they want. There's no evidence that would directly correlate Dr. Fauci intentionally creating COVID in a Wuhan Chinese lab to kill millions and millions of people. I think that hurts somebody's credibility when they make that claim, Steve. I just do.
Okay, well, we're going to have to agree to disagree on this, Brian, because you said I only had 30 minutes on your show.
We got a little more time. Yep, but this is important.
Okay, but it's important to ask the question why the NIH, the FDA, the CDC has never called for anybody to do assessments as to whether anybody died from the vaccine or not. We didn't even do the assessments, Brian, in the clinical trials. And there were 4 times as many people who died from cardiac symptoms in the clinical trial in the treatment group versus the placebo group. Now, that's statistically kind of odd, but it wasn't statistically significant because the numbers were too low. But they never did any of the histopathology in order to assess whether or not the vaccines were causal in those deaths in the clinical trials. And I wrote to Pfizer and I asked them, hey, do you have any evidence? Did you ever do any of the histopathology to determine whether those deaths in the clinical trials were associated with the vaccine or not? And they didn't respond, which means they don't have the data. Nobody has ever seen the data showing that they did the proper assays to determine whether those people who died in the clinical trials. So everybody is, and so when you look at the evidence, they said, well, it was the opinion of the investigators in the trial that the death wasn't related to the vaccine. Well, that's nice, but why didn't you do the proper scientific tests in the studies that everybody is relying on? Why, Brian, don't you think that's a problem?
So, Steve, here's where we agree. Okay. I think there are 2 problems.
You're not answering my question.
I am going to answer your question. Here's where we agree. Good. And I'm going to give you 2 problems. Problem number 1, I'm on your side. I think everybody should get all the information that they need to make a proper assessment of the vaccines and what dangers there may or not be within the vaccines. Now, obviously, there are some parameters where you're not going to get everyone's personal medical history. You're not going to get everyone's autopsies and exactly what was done in that autopsy. You're going to get a death certificate. But I'm also on your side where I think, we should get as much information as we possibly can get to make an assessment. So I'm with you there. But here's where we disagree again. I think you are leaping to a conclusion where there's no evidence to prove that over 500,000 people have died from vaccinations in this country. And
okay, let's talk about the circumstantial evidence that I have been able to obtain from authorities, which is gold standard. How about that? Millions of records, 4 million records. Is that enough for you?
4 million records where on their death certificate, it says that they died from the vaccinations.
No.
Okay.
No, I have 4 million records from the New Zealand.
Okay.
Health New Zealand. I have 4 million records of people who got the vaccine.
Okay,
and
but hold on.
Some of them died and some of them didn't die.
Understood. But Steve, I didn't ask you for the stats from New Zealand.
No, you asked me for evidence. You said I had no evidence. You made the claim that I have no evidence.
In America, you're claiming that
I do have evidence. I do have evidence in America too. I have the data from Medicare. It's on my Substack. I published it on my Substack. If you look at the Medicare data that I published in the Substack, when people get the shots in Medicare, you see that their death rates increase after they get the shots. but the death rate should be going down because they're getting the shots at the time then when background death rates are decreasing. So their death rates are going the wrong way. Okay, this is Medicare data. This is gold standard US data that shows that the vaccines are actually accelerating all-cause mortality. I also have data, Brian, from the United States of America, again from Medicare, from the US nursing homes. And I can show you how people get the vaccine and how people who get COVID, and I can show you that the graphs line up. And the problem with that is that when the vaccines, the problem, you asked for evidence, Brian. Let me explain what the evidence is. You're interrupting me. Let me explain what the evidence is so that you can respond to it.
Because I understand, but you're skipping around. You said you have evidence from Medicare and data suggesting that people are dying at a higher rate after being vaccinated. But is that direct correlation to, well, they were vaccinated and then they died, so it must be from the vaccine? That's still not hard evidence that they're dying from the vaccine.
No, but it's unexplained. It's unexplained evidence as to why.
If it's unexplainable, then why?
Because there's no other credible explanation for what the observed data is.
So during COVID, when people were locked down, there's no direct correlation that people would have been less healthy. There's no direct correlation that if you didn't have a job, you might have been less healthy, stuck in your apartment or your house. There's no less correlation of the stresses financially and what people were going through at that time could have correlated to heart disease or somebody suffering from depression or taking medications that they shouldn't have taken. You're just going to leaps and bounds to say, well, since there's no explanation, let's just assume they all died of the vaccination. And now you're going to nursing homes and you're saying, well, we went into nursing homes and the data shows that they're done. These are very, very old people. And when they contract COVID, whether they're vaccinated or not, I would imagine a lot of those people, sadly, are not going to make it. But you're making an assertion and an assumption. And that's where my problem is. If you have direct evidence, I am all with you, Stephen. I'm with you 150%. But again, my problem with a lot of the things that you're saying in this interview is you're making assumptions without real direct evidence. You gave me a study of 35 dead bodies in another country, and I guess they found 5 people died from the vaccinations. I don't even know if that's true, but even if it was, 35 bodies compared to you're saying over 500,000 people in this country without direct evidence, just because Medicare tells you that, well, you know what? These people were vaccinated. These people weren't. Higher death rates for people that were vaccinated still doesn't mean they died from the vaccination.
Brian, the Medicare data is looking at the death date from the time of the vaccine. And you can see the peaks, and it's correlated to the time of the vaccine. If you just look at the overall deaths, those things are, basically flat lines. They don't go anywhere. But here you could see it when you look at it relative to the time of the shot. Then the correlations happen and you can see the effect. The only way you can get an effect like that if it's correlated with the shot. Now, in the case of the Medicare in the nursing homes, we looked at the curve of the COVID infections, and then we looked at the curve of the COVID deaths. Now, what's supposed to happen? Suppose one curve, the infections is here and the deaths are here. And the infections go up and the deaths go up, the infections go down, the deaths go down, they're all proportional. Now, what's supposed to happen when you get a vaccine is the deaths are supposed to drop disproportionately to the infection. So if you have an infection, it's a 1% chance that you die as opposed to a 10% chance that you die. But so what happened? So what happened when we rolled out the vaccines to this elderly population? The ratio of infections to deaths did not change.
You're dealing with people in their 80s. You're dealing with people in their 80s.
That was the population that the vaccine was designed to protect. The people who are the most vulnerable. And what happened is, and they said it was a 10x reduction in death. And there was no reduction in death from COVID for the elderly people. But in fact, we have anecdotes where we go in and we look at individual hospitals and we hear these stories that they rolled out the vaccines to the elderly population. And what happened is that they were getting like a death a day after they gave people these vaccines, and they had to call people back from vacation in one of these nursing homes because the deaths were just skyrocketing after they were giving out these vaccines, which they gave out in December.
Right. But I would say that the deaths were skyrocketing regardless. There was a point where we were losing 5,000 people a day in this country. And again, it's an assumption without a proper autopsy given, without direct correlation. All we have is, well, they died and they were vaccinated.
They had normal death rates before they were giving out the vaccines, and all of a sudden these deaths started skyrocketing.
And were any of those deaths?
I've got another geriatric
okay, but hold on, let's go with that.
clinic.
Hold on. Before we go to that
we can look at the records, and we can see
Understood.
that 10 deaths a year, and now it's 34. It's 30 or 40 deaths a year in 2023.
Okay, so I would ask you the same question with those deaths as well, and we got to run here, unfortunately, but I would ask you the same question, and I would like to have you back to continue this conversation. But I would ask, of those 30 to 40 deaths of all those people, sadly, who died in those convalescent homes, was an autopsy given? What is the cause of death? What was stated on their death certificate? That's all that matters to me, because that shows direct evidence, not anecdotal evidence, not evidence that people claim, but actual direct evidence that somebody died from getting vaccinated. And
and I told you, Brian, if you want direct evidence, you need to do the autopsies with the proper stains. Nobody
then
wants
why don't we
to
wait?
We don't have the direct evidence because, Brian, nobody is doing the studies.
Okay.
So, Brian, why aren't you talking to Tony Fauci? Why aren't you calling the FDA? And why aren't you talking to the CDC? And why don't you ask the CDC, why aren't you guys doing the proper assessments so that you can clear up all this misinformation and prove that people aren't dying from the vaccine? Why aren't you collecting the data?
Well, I would say
they're not collecting the data.
I would say to this, direct autopsies are not 100% in that every person is going to get one. The CDC can't just raise their hand and say, you died of a heart attack, so we're going to, well, it does matter. You died of a heart attack, so we're going to force your family to make sure that the victim has an autopsy. That's not how the medical profession works.
But Brian, I'm not asking you to do that. I'm just saying that for people who are getting
to do that.
No, I'm just saying that for people who are getting an autopsy anyway, they're already there. They're already on the autopsy table. You simply go and you add the test to assess for COVID vaccination.
Some families don't want autopsies, and some
it's okay.
families,
it's only for the people who have autopsies.
Okay.
I'm not. I never told you to say that we should force people to have autopsies.
Sure,
I'm just saying when there's an autopsy,
so in a
why
perfect
aren't we
world,
doing the test?
in a perfect world, Steve, I have no problem with that. But you said it yourself. Direct evidence. We don't have. Hold on. We don't
because we're not collecting it.
Okay, hold on. I don't. Whatever. Because that's a different topic. But the bottom line is, regardless of why we don't have direct evidence, we don't have direct evidence. So I'm going to make an assumption that 500,000 people have died in this country of the vaccines. That's where we disagree. I want you to come back on.
Brian, it's from lots of different sources.
Okay, well, guess what?
They're all consistent.
There are sources out there that say aliens are probing people too. I don't know what those sources are, with all due respect. I don't know where they're from. Sources don't mean anything. You know that best. I mean, there are hit pieces written on me.
Okay.
I mean, sources.
Brian, you should read Denny Rancourt's analysis. And they tried to debunk him in a debate with a prominent person on the other side, and they couldn't debunk it. Okay. And he did a multinational study. It was worldwide. He looked at Southern Hemisphere because they're out of phase with us in terms of when they have sickness, so he can reduce the number of confounders.
Yep.
And Rancourt's study, which was well over 100 pages, showed that a death rate higher than 1 per 1,000 on average.
Okay, well, again,
this is a very well done study that nobody has been able to pick apart.
Again,
maybe you should have Denny Rancourt on your show and have him
bring
on someone who tries to debate him and see what happens. It's not going to end well.
Well, I mean, listen, I don't know how it would end. I would ask him the same questions I would ask you, and you openly admitted that we don't have direct
evidence. But he says he will show you that when so Brian, when the vaccines go up like this and the deaths go up and track the
let me ask you a question.
Vaccines,
and I got it because
you would think the vaccine might be causing it, right? Because there's no other explanation.
I have another guest waiting.
What?
I want to ask you one direct question that has nothing to do with vaccines, and this is my frustration with people that talk about direct evidence. 7 out of 10 Republicans, and I'm going to make it political now, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about. 7 out of 10 Republicans believe Donald Trump won the 2020 election. There is no direct evidence of widespread voter fraud. Who won the 2020 election?
I haven't looked at the election issues, so
I haven't asked you. Well, I know you haven't looked at it.
But your opinion, but I want to give you opinion on something that I haven't done the research on.
Hold on a second. Hold on a second. You can't answer
election fraud. I don't think there was election fraud. If that's the question you're asking me, I have not seen any hard evidence of election fraud. Okay,
but hard evidence that over 500,000 people
doesn't mean that there isn't election fraud. It just means I haven't seen
voter fraud. No widespread voter fraud that could have changed the outcome of the election. There's literally zero evidence to prove that, yet 7 out of 10 Republicans think that Trump won. So there's going to be a lot of people in this country that are going to think something without direct evidence. It doesn't mean that it happened. That's the point.
Absolutely. I'm saying that I have not seen any direct evidence that.
Understood. I haven't seen it, and I haven't seen any direct evidence that 500,000 people have died from the vaccine. Steve, I want you to come back.
Yes, but I've seen that's because they're not gathering it, Brian.
I understand your point.
That's the reason you haven't seen it. But all of the indirect evidence, Brian, shows that this is the case.
Okay. I hear what you're saying. I appreciate your perspective. I want you to come back on the show. These are important conversations that I'm always willing to have with people. And Steve, you're one of those people, and you're always welcome back. Steve Kirsch, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.
Appreciate that. All right. I don't want to keep this guy waiting any longer because he had to listen to that. So,